When you hear or think of Synology, your mind immediately goes to NAS or DSM. But what if I told you that Synology makes a different operating system that has a loyal following and functions extremely similarly to DSM? SRM, or the Synology Router Manager, is an operating system that runs on Synology routers, and I've been wanting to try it for a long time. I use and have used pfSense and Unify firewalls, and if I gave you either and you spent time learning how to use them, you'll be able to do a lot more with those than you can with SRM. But it isn't even close from an ease of use perspective. And about 80% of what I've used both of those for can be done on SRM. So we're going to configure an extremely powerful segregated home network, which means that your IoT devices like smart TVs, thermostats, and smart home devices will be blocked from communicating with your NAS and PCs at the firewall level. We'll have a guest network with isolation, meaning that the guest network won't be able to communicate with the IoT or LAN network, but the devices on the network won't be able to communicate with each other either. And then a few additional cool features in SRM. Now, the reason you'd want to do this is because there are a ton of devices that utilize Wi-Fi these days, like air conditioners, thermostats, air purifiers. Everything has an app, it's all controlled through Wi-Fi, and a lot of those devices aren't going to get patched, meaning that if there's a security vulnerability, it may not get patched, and it may stay that way for as long as you use it. Now, if you don't have a segregated network, that device that has a security vulnerability will be on the same network as your NAS device and your PCs and mobile phones. But with a segregated network, they'll be on their own VLAN, which means that it's on its own Wi-Fi network and communication will be blocked at the firewall level. Simply put, the untrusted device can no longer access your trusted devices like your NAS, PC, and mobile phone. As soon as you learn and understand how segregated networks work, you won't want to go back to a regular router. Now, before we get started, this is not a sponsored video, but as a disclaimer, I asked Synology to send me a router, and they sent me their RT6600AX for free to test out SRM. Finally, I'm going to try and advertise this more, but if you want to hire me, link in the description. So this is actually SRM. It looks extremely similar to Synology DSM. It functions extremely similarly as well. You have the package center, etc. But the difference is there is this network center. Now, this network center is basically how you're going to manage this entire router, plus a few of the other apps, which we'll take a look at later. But all I did up to this point is I set up the router, created my user account, and I logged in. So inside of this network center, what you will see is basically everything in terms of your ISP. So this is connected right now to my internet service provider. But the first thing that we're going to take a look at is the local network section. So this is where we're going to begin to create our segregated network. So at this point, the only thing that I did is when I configured the device, I set up the SSID to be WT-network. This will make a little more sense later. So when you're connecting to Wi-Fi, you would connect to WT-network, type in the password, and you'll be connected to the router. But other than that, everything is set as default. So for now, what we're going to do is we are going to leave the primary network on the 192.168.1.1 subnet. However, what I want to do is modify the guest network. So what I'm going to do is select it, and I'm going to select edit here. First thing you're going to see is the VLAN ID of 1733, subnet of 192.168.2. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to modify this. So I'm going to modify this to be 192.168.10.1, and then I'm going to change the VLAN ID to match that. If you actually wanted to use this VLAN ID, you could set up a device using that VLAN ID to actually exist on this guest network. But for now, network isolation. So what you'll see is the communication between this network and other local networks will be blocked. So that will basically do everything that we have to do in terms of blocking. So from this point forward, the guest network will not be able to communicate with our local network. So the next thing I want to do is actually modify the Wi-Fi network. So right now it's currently set up as Synology Guest. What we're going to do is we are going to edit it. And what you'll see here is that we can enable wireless here, but we're going to change this to be WT-guest. So we have WT-network, and now we have WT-guest. Now you can also choose to hide this if you'd like, but we're going to show it for now. So after changing the actual password, you can modify some of these other settings. We're going to leave everything as default. The other interesting thing is that you could actually set up a schedule. So this is when the network will be used, and it can be disabled at other times. You can also set up a portal. So if you wanted to set up a portal for users to log in, you can do that as well. And client isolation. block client devices connected to the guest network from connecting with each other inside of this network. So what we're going to do is we're going to enable that. So that would mean that if you have two guest devices, they cannot communicate with each other. So we're going to save this. Okay, so now that the Wi-Fi is configured, what we're going to do is we're going to modify the DHCP server. So it's still set as the old 192.168.2. So I am just going to come in here and change that all to 192.168.10. But as soon as you select OK here, our guest network is configured. So we have isolation, meaning that the guest network cannot actually access the LAN network. And we have client isolation as well, meaning that the devices on the actual guest network cannot access each other either. So the next thing we have to do is actually configure our IoT network. Now, the IoT network stands for Internet of Things. This is going to be basically all of your Wi-Fi devices that are not trusted. So this primary network here, this is going to be your PCs, mobile phones, your NAS, potentially a few other devices, any servers you have. And then basically everything else for the most part is going to go on this third IoT network we're going to create. So what we're going to do is select create here. And then what we're going to do is we are going to give it a network name. I'm going to use the subnet 192.168.20.1 and the VLAN ID of 20. Now, I'm not going to enable network isolation, and the reason is because I want to be able to access these devices potentially from my local network. So I will show you after this what we're going to do is create a firewall rule to block access from the IoT network to our primary network. So we're going to leave that as is. And then this is going to be a little different than the guest network. So we're going to select next. Now, if you wanted to, what you could do is you could actually select a specific port on the actual router that will only be for this specific network. So if you were thinking of this in terms of your network, if you had a switch that was plugged into port 3 and you wanted that switch to only be used for the IoT network, or another VLAN that you configured, you would actually go in and you could specify a specific port that would only use this specific VLAN. For now, I'm going to leave everything as default. They're set as trunk ports, which basically means you can use the primary network or any of the VLANs based on a VLAN tag, but we're not really getting into that right this second. So we're going to leave everything as is. We're going to select next. And now at this step, what we're going to do is we are going to create a SSID. And then what you'll see here is I set up an SSID and a password. And now on all of those devices, rather than connecting to our primary network, we're actually going to connect to this IoT network. We can select next. And then at that point, we are going to apply everything. So now that the IoT network is created, the only other thing I want to show is if we edit this and we select IPv4 DHCP, remember DHCP is what hands out IP addresses. So right now, it will hand out IP addresses 2 through 254. If you wanted to reserve some of those, you could set that as 200. And then you'd have, over 50 IP addresses that could actually be reserved for specific devices. I like to do it this way so that I know basically anything above, let's say 150 or 200 is reserved and can only be set as an actual reserved IP address. And as soon as you do that, what you could actually do is in the DHCP reservation section, you can actually set a specific device to always use an individual IP address. So this is extremely powerful, especially if you're port forwarding or just want to ensure that a specific device has the same IP address at the router level. This is the best way to do it. Okay, so remember, as of right now, the IoT network can actually access our primary network. And that is because I turned off network isolation on the IoT network and the primary network. So what we're going to do is create a firewall rule to ensure that the IoT network cannot access the guest or the primary network. And to do that, we're going to select security, firewall, and then we are going to create a new rule. So I gave it a name, and in the protocol section, I'm going to use TCP and UDP. And then what we're going to do is we are going to select LAN. Now, this is a source. So we're going to select specific networks and IoT network. And then we are going to scroll down and basically everything on all ports to the destination networks will be blocked. Now, remember, if you wanted to access specific networks, you could uncheck whichever networks you actually want to access. But for now, we're just going to leave this as all local networks. We are going to deny traffic, and then we're going to select OK. Finally, we'll save, and then I'm going to do the exact same thing, but I'm going to do it for ICMP as well, so everything gets blocked. Okay, so as of right now, TCP, UDP, and ICMP are all blocked. So what I'm going to show you is that as of right now, I am able to access my Synology NAS on the actual IP address. I'm going to hop off this network. I'm going to log into the IoT network, and then we're going to see what happens. Okay, so we're on the IoT network, and if I try and access this again, we're not going to be able to access it. And what you'll also see is that we're not going to be able to actually access the router either. Traffic is blocked on both. You'll also see that I can't actually ping either of these devices. So at that point, the firewall rule is blocking traffic from the IoT network to the other network. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to temporarily put this Synology NAS on the IoT network, and then we're going to see what happens. Okay, so what I did is I put the Synology NAS on the IoT network, and as you can see, I connected back to the IoT network. We cannot actually access the NAS on its old IP address, but if we try and access it at its new IP address here on the IoT network, we will be able to get to it. So what that means is the IoT devices can access each other, but they cannot access anything outside of the IoT network. So at this point, this network is completely segregated at this point. The IoT network can access the IoT devices on its own subnet. And I like to do that because a lot of times they will work together. But at the same time, if you wanted to, you could actually limit traffic down and ensure that they're not actually able to access anything other than the external internet. But that is, in essence, exactly how the Synology firewall works. Now, let's assume that you created a camera VLAN. A lot of times users don't want cameras leaving their actual internal network. What you do is you'd create a separate VLAN for your cameras. Let's assume that the IoT network right now is our camera VLAN. And then what you do is, as the destination, you would actually deny all traffic everywhere. And then what that would say is that that entire VLAN cannot actually access the external internet. So the point here is that you could see very quickly how you're able to create a fully functional and fully segregated network by just modifying some of these firewall rules. Now, there's a lot more that you could do here. If you have to do any port forwarding, if you were running a VPN server, you could do that here. However, if you're going to use Synology's SRM, you would probably use the VPN Plus server application here. So you run the VPN directly on your actual router as opposed to running it on a server inside of your local network. But they have a bunch of different options here. Traditionally, you're probably going to use OpenVPN. It's very similar to the Synology DSM setup, but you can do that. There are other options as well. You can set up a full DNS server. And then they also have some pretty cool options in terms of how you can use these devices. So probably not the best way to do this, but if you were to buy multiple, you can set one of them up as an actual access point. And then inside of this smart WAN setting, this is actually pretty cool. So on a lot of more powerful firewalls, we'll say, you can actually have redundancy. So you can set up two ISPs either as failover, meaning that if your primary WAN internet connection goes down, it would use whatever LAN interface you configured as the secondary WAN interface. And then at that point, if the primary goes down, it will automatically switch over to the secondary. You're probably not going to buy a second ISP if you're using a Synology router, but that is an option. Second option is actually load balancing. So if you wanted to load balance both of them and have the actual internet connection go out over both of them, you can do that as well. There's also a mobile network section. There's safe access as well, and web filters, and a lot of different things here. But generally, you're going to be inside of this network center here and this Wi-Fi Connect. This is where you'll actually configure all of your Wi-Fi settings. So these are the two applications you're going to use the most, I'd say. But there's a lot more to SRM, and I don't want to get into it, but the point is you can do a lot of other things, and it's extremely, extremely easy to configure all of this, at least in comparison to the competitors. Overall, I can honestly say it's one of the easiest firewall operating systems I've ever used. I admit that it might be because I'm comfortable in DSM and it's extremely similar, but if you compare this to some of the other options out there, it won't be as feature-filled, but it also won't have as steep of a learning curve. I truly believe that this gets you 80% of the way there in terms of what you could want to configure on a firewall while being 75% easier. If you want to see more SRM content, leave it in the comments. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next time.